Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good week. Another busy week in regards to weather and whatnot. Hope everybody's doing well and keeping safe. As usual, just giving it a moment to let everybody join today. We are again fully virtual today, and we have a very special Grand Rounds, one that we've been really planning for just about a year now, and we're really lucky to have Dr. Wise with us today. Before that, we don't have many updates. We particularly have not many updates today. One, because we wanted to give lots of time for this special Grand Rounds, and two, luckily there's not been a lot that needs to be updated, at least in regards to COVID and whatnot. So we're really happy to not have a lot of negative things going on that need updating right now. But as I always mention, if there are any things you'd like to see updated here or anywhere through our communications, please do message me. We just recently finished our communications survey and we got a lot of great feedback from all of you. If there's anything else that you didn't get to fill in or you want communicated again, please feel free to directly reach out to me, and we'll be sharing more of those results in the coming time. So thank you for those of you who filled those out. That being said, we don't have much updates. We do have Dr. Shah who wanted to update on the new website. Dr. Shah, I'll turn over to you.
Good morning, and for those of you who I may be a new face to, I'm Jonathan Shaw. I'm our inaugural Associate Chair of Community Partnership for our Department of Medicine. I'm really excited to announce that we now have launched our website for the Department of Medicine's Community Partnership Program, and this program reflects our department's growing commitment to diversity and health equity. And the launched website highlights our mission to build external bridges to enhance our local health equity, and it's an important synergy with our really strong DEI internal work and leadership. And so please check out the website and view the resources. Please reach out to me or our program director, Alex Blacker, if you'd like to get involved. And we're really looking to create many paths for engagement between you, our faculty, and our community partners, and to engage new community partners. So please check it out. It's on the top left of the website, up next to the diversity, equity, inclusion landing page.
Great, Dr. Shah, thank you so much. We're really happy to have you in this leadership position and doing everything that you have been and have been doing for years, by the way, and will be doing in this relatively new role. So thanks so much. Dr. Shah will send out the link that you guys can check out as well. That being said, again, we don't have a ton of updates today. I just want to mention next week's Grand Round speaker is Dr. Yuri Lauterbom. He will be talking about colorectal screening, what has come of age, what's next. There's been a lot of changes in colorectal screening really in the last recent time and years. And so there's lots of questions about that. So thanks to Dr. Lauterbom for presenting on that next week. That will be also on Zoom only. Well, that being said, we have today's presenter, Dr. Paul Wise. And again, I want to mention this has been a Grand Rounds that we've been planning for quite some time, as you can imagine, since the war began in Ukraine. Dr. Wise is the Richard E. Behrman Professor of Child Health and Society and Professor of Pediatrics and Health Policy at Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Wise is also the Senior Fellow in the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the Center for International Security and Cooperation in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. He's also the co-director of the March Dine Center for Prematurity Research at Stanford. Dr. Wise received his AB degree, summa cum laude in Latin American Studies, and his MD degree from Cornell. He also received a Master's of Public Health degree from Harvard and did his pediatric training at Children's Hospital in Boston. His former positions include the Director of Emergency and Primary Care Services at Boston Children's Hospital, Director of Harvard Institute for Reproductive Health, and the Vice Chief of Division of Social Medicine and Health Inequities at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard. He served as a special assistant for the U.S. Surgeon General, the chair of the steering committee of the NIH Global Networks for Women's and Children's Health Research, and is currently a member of the Advisory Council of the National Institute of Health and Human Development at the NIH. Dr. Wise's research focuses on health inequities, child health policy, and global child health. He leads multidisciplinary initiatives for children in crisis, which is directed at integrating expertise in his political science, security, and health services, and areas of civil conflict and unstable governments. And I'll show this next slide. I saw this in the news just about a year ago, and similar posts, and I knew immediately I had to invite Dr. Wise to come present. Dr. Wise, by the way, before health policy became its own department, and still now through our communications programs for the last 8 years, Dr. Wise is consistently someone we want to emphasize because he's always been doing amazing work and the type of work that really inspires you. And obviously the stuff he's been doing in Ukraine is with the Ukrainian patients and children has been very inspiring. And so this is, again, something we've been looking forward to inviting him. And it got a little delayed due to my error back in the fall, and we pushed it back a little bit, but I think it's as important as ever. And so Dr. Wise, thank you so much for being with us today. Again, we've been looking forward to this. I'll turn it over to you, and thanks everybody for being here as well.
Thank you, Errol. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. It's a privilege to be here, Errol. I really appreciate it. I'm going to begin with this slide. You may have seen this slide, this photograph of Omram Daknish, 5 years of age, was pulled from a damaged building after what was likely a Russian airstrike in the northern Syrian city of Aleppo in 2016. While this photograph went viral and is clearly a powerful image, its power is magnified by the recognition that Omram's injuries that day were not unique or even unusual. They were typical. Omram was but one of 12 children pulled from the rubble of that building on that same day, taken to the same hospital in what was a typical day in Aleppo. In many ways, my comments this morning are an attempt to make sense of this photograph, both of its sentimental power, but also its routine prevalence. This is a map of risk of violent death in the world. And what you can see are areas of the world that are in active combat, active organized violence, and others which are, by and large, protracted violence, some criminal, some organized violence related to political contestation. And in fact, there are 42 countries in the world in conflict and 100 million people displaced by conflict. In fact, more than half of all children in sub-Saharan Africa are living in countries that are experiencing violent conflict. What is important to recognize is that if you took the top infant mortality rates by country in the world and just listed the top 20, the highest infant mortality rates in the world, 19 of those 20 are countries in conflict. That global child health has increasingly become global child health in areas of violent conflict. And because of that, we began an effort that we call Children in Crisis, which is an attempt to link security studies, the political science, the concerns around humanitarian protections, international humanitarian law, with issues of child health, and have a series of programs, projects, and initiatives focused on bridging these disciplines to address this issue. Now, most discussions around children, civilians in conflict relate to the direct effects. Now, the direct effects are the effects on people of exposure to bombs and bullets, injuries, trauma, and particularly with the use and increasing use of explosive munitions in densely populated areas. The issue of direct effects in children is, in fact, dramatic. And many organizations like Doctors Without Borders, International Rescue Committee, International Committee of the Red Cross, address the direct effects as their primary mission. There are also direct mental health effects by exposure to combat, exposure to traumatic events early in life can have lifelong implications. And both the acute and protracted mental health implications can be profound. And we were part of a small team that evaluated the trauma response to civilian casualties in the Battle of Mosul in northern Iraq, 2016-17. And in visiting one of the field hospitals during the battle, I came across this little guy. And it was a reminder of how warfare evolves and how the nature of combatants can change. This little guy had part of his foot amputated, but had been doing very well. You could see he's smiling. In fact, had been ready to go home for some time, but the hospital staff had no place to send him because he was an orphan. And he was an orphan because both his father and mother were ISIS suicide bombers. That the nature of warfare and the nature of the combatants is always evolving, and the humanitarian response must evolve in response. What I'm going to talk about more today is not so much the direct effects, the direct exposure to bombs and bullets, but rather the indirect effects. The indirect effects are the death, illness, hardship, suffering, not through direct exposure to combat, but through the destruction of the essentials of life, the essentials for human survival: food, water, shelter, healthcare, and how violent conflict can destroy those essentials and create reverberating effects throughout civilian population, and particularly among children. And we have some estimates of the indirect effects. This is a study that was conducted in Darfur at the height of the fighting. It was in Western Sudan. And of course, there was significant excess mortality that took place there. But virtually, 87% of the excess mortality was considered nonviolent, that it was not directly related to exposure to bombs and bullets, but rather were the indirect effects by the destruction of the essentials of life. We also saw this in the Eastern Congo and the DRC at the height of the fighting. Again, there was a general elevation of mortality in young children, but the causes of the elevation looked like this: fever, malaria, diarrhea, neonatal, acute respiratory infection. And anybody who's worked in global child health will tell you this is exactly the distribution of causes of death that are prevalent in virtually all very low resource areas, that were the indirect effects that made the big difference, not only in Western Sudan, but also in the DRC at the height of the fighting. And in fact, we've looked at virtually all the major violent conflicts over the past 20 years or so. And on average, about 60 to 70% of excess mortality is indirect. And in the areas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the fighting has been protracted, more than 90% of the excess mortality in children is indirect mortality, not direct mortality. So we have been very focused in our work on examining, elevating, and addressing the indirect effects of violent conflict. One of our projects estimated that among the indirect effects, that 60–70% of these indirect effects are preventable with capabilities we have right now. That if we just implemented vaccines, other therapies that we know we have, we know that they work, that we can prevent up to 70% of the indirect effects. The tragedy, of course, is that we are not implementing it, and the relative disregard for the indirect effects is something that we feel strongly we need to address. We've also been involved with a series of projects, including examination with colleagues at Hopkins, at the impact of conflict on the cholera epidemic in Yemen, one of the worst on record. And we examined Saudi airstrikes on water treatment centers and water infrastructure in Yemen, and found a strong association between Saudi airstrikes and the prolongation as well as the outbreak of cholera in these areas. And I'm going to show you some pictures that are difficult for anybody to look at, but I'm going to show you what the face of indirect effects really looks like. This is a child in Yemen, chronic severe malnutrition. Again, malnutrition and cholera. And this is what indirect effects look like, and often are relatively neglected because the amount of time that it takes and the complexity of addressing and assessing indirect effects, something that we feel strongly in our work here at Stanford with colleagues around the world that we want to address. And we also want to make sure that in the discussion about the indirect effects and the two cases that I'm going to elevate today, Ukraine, kids at our southern border, we do not forget about the other areas of the world in which the indirect effects are playing out here. This is Tigray in East Africa, where there continues to be a profound humanitarian disaster playing out, primarily, again, as indirect effects as the essentials of life are destroyed. That these conflicts at times become invisible and fall off the world stage. And it's always critical to remember how important the indirect effects in these other areas of violent conflict remain. I'm now going to turn to Ukraine. As you know, in February last year, Russia invaded Ukraine with the use of explosive munitions throughout urban areas in really throughout Ukraine. And this is a map which is based on the ACLED database, which is Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is a very important database that notes violent events. This is primarily explosive events in Ukraine over the past year. And you can see that it's concentrated in the east and the south, but the major urban centers throughout the country have been hit by Russian munitions. Also want to point out those numbers, and the blue arrows are refugee populations, people leaving Ukraine to neighboring countries. See that the largest number have gone to Russia, particularly from the Russian-speaking areas in the east. But Poland has had to address the requirements of 1.5 million refugees who have fled. And you can see the other countries in the surrounding areas, that there are millions of people who have fled Ukraine into neighboring countries, really throughout Europe and throughout the world. It's also critically important to recognize that health infrastructure has been not only targeted, but heavily damaged throughout Ukraine. And this is PHR's mapping of attacks on healthcare infrastructure throughout Ukraine. And it has damaged the ability, particularly early in the war, of Ukrainian health systems to care for their own population. And these attacks on healthcare infrastructure in Ukraine are part of a larger phenomenon that we've seen around the world, the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, and other areas of violent conflict around the world. And a series of enterprises, initiatives have begun to document and address and elevate in public discourse attacks on health infrastructure. And the impact on Ukraine has been significant. And the case that I'm going to talk about, the indirect effects of one kind of sentinel illustrative case, is children with cancer in Ukraine. These are children in a bomb shelter in the city of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. You see their active treatment for their cancer. And then particularly in the first few months of the war, there was great uncertainty about how significant the Russian invasion would be, the attacks on major urban centers, attacks on health infrastructure. And among the most concerning were kids with serious chronic illness, particularly in this case, kids in active treatment for cancer. And a extant pediatric oncology network in Europe, Ukraine, and actually included Russia, that St. Jude Global, St. Jude Research Hospital in Memphis, a major pediatric oncology hospital in the United States, had created this network primarily for professional interaction, collaborative research. But with the outbreak of the war, it pivoted to deal with cases of children in active treatment for cancer, and created a pathway in Ukraine to funnel children throughout the country to the Western Ukrainian Specialized Children's Medical Center. Dr. Roman Kisma is the director, and that hospital became the kind of triage center for children who are coming with cancer, coming to that facility in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, to be reassessed, documentation of the case, and prepared for evacuation into Poland, and ultimately to locations throughout Europe. The focus, particularly in the first few months, was evacuation, transfer the kids to oncology facilities capable of handling them, primarily in Western Europe. And this effort included strong logistical and clinical support from the Polish Pediatric Hem-Onc Society, Polish hospitals that just welcomed these patients to Poland and helped triage them for ultimate transfer to other facilities around Europe. There's collaboration across 29 different countries, primarily in Europe, but also in Canada and the United States, and support from foundations both in Ukraine and in Poland, and ongoing support, significant support from the team at St. Jude Global. And the focus began with a focus on transfer, and has since shifted to not only transferring kids when necessary, but in strengthening the Ukrainian systems of care so the kids can remain in Ukraine. And I'm privileged to have been a senior advisor to this network, continue to be, and have traveled back and forth to Poland quite a bit since the outbreak of the war. And this is a train that's coming from the Ukrainian border to the triage center in Poland, met by Polish firefighters, Red Cross volunteers, where the children are transported on the train and taken to this triage center in Poland, where they were reassessed, all the medical documentation translated, and within 24 to 48 hours, they left this triage facility and went on to facilities around Europe and North America. I was privileged to be on one of the first flights with these kids coming to the United States. They went to St. Jude in Memphis. But as you can see, that primarily these children went to EU countries, countries in Western Europe. And to date, about 1,300 children have been evacuated out of Ukraine. And again, still children are being evacuated because of the security situation where they were residing, but also some with very specialized needs that get transferred to facilities around Europe. However, the emphasis now is strengthening and supporting Ukrainian healthcare systems so that they can continue to take care of them in Ukraine. And the emphasis now for much of our work is focused on the Ukrainian system. And this is a team in a meeting that took place in Poland late spring of the country directors from all the different countries that are welcoming these children into Europe. This network continues to function in evaluating the patients that are needing transfer to locations around Europe and at times North America. But we are still faced with continuing attacks on health infrastructure. And the great concern now is that with the spring offensive will come escalation in the fighting, and therefore the potential need for mass transfer, mass evacuation once again. And because of that, we are working hard to strengthen the infrastructure for transfer. And here, this is my last visit a month or so ago to Rzeszów, Poland, on the border at the airport, which is the site of the EU medevac hub, which has been continuing to evacuate large numbers of Ukrainians who have been injured, primarily Ukrainian soldiers, to locations around Europe. And we are going to collaborate with this hub to help in case there are large numbers of children with serious chronic illness who need evacuation in the months to come. We are also focused on other threats to child well-being, which made the news over the last 2 weeks of the International Criminal Court, focused on Putin and the Russian effort to deport children for adoption out of Ukraine into Russian families. I'm now going to turn to another indirect effect, a different kind of indirect effect of violence, and that is children on the US-Mexican border. You may remember that over the past few years, there's been a large increase in the number of migrants coming to the US southern border. Most from the Northern Triangle of Central America, and really hitting different parts of the border at different times, but in large numbers. This is Del Rio, where more than 10,000 Haitians last spring came to Del Rio. And how they wind up in different parts of the border is a complicated story, but it's generally controlled by the smugglers, largely the cartels, which will funnel large numbers of migrants to different parts of the border. But the impact on the border and on the US capabilities to detain and process the migrants coming to the border has been largely overwhelmed. Now, what's supposed to happen? And what's supposed to happen is that migrants coming to the border between ports of entry are international bridges or airports, and the vast, vast majority of migrants hitting the border are coming between ports of entry. And that's the arena of Border Patrol. Border Patrol is the largest federal law enforcement agency, and there had always been large numbers of migrants coming to the border. What has changed over the last 2 years is the demography of the migrants, that almost always it was adult Mexican men looking for work. And now the majority are families and unaccompanied children coming to the border. And what you have is a situation where we have a system that was built to detain, house, and process basically adult men, now caring for hundreds of thousands of families and children on our southern border. And one of the responses in a very dynamic policy response by the United States government was back in 2018 was the zero tolerance policy, which was basically child separation from families, which basically said that all undocumented, what they call undocumented aliens, are going to be criminally prosecuted. Parents are going to go to an adult detention facility, basically jail, and you can't send kids to real jails. So the children are going to go to Health and Human Services shelters. They're basically unaccompanied children, which all unaccompanied children go to Border Patrol first, and then ultimately to Health and Human Services shelters. So the zero tolerance policy was creating unaccompanied children where they were really coming with their parents as part of families. And the impact of photographs, audio tapes of kids being separated from their parents created an uproar. And the uproar was not just with your typical suspects. There are the progressive blue state constituencies. It was across the board. The conservatives, Republicans felt that this was going too far. And within 6 weeks of the implementation of the zero tolerance policy was ended. However, the nature, the scale of the challenge of the migrants, particularly children, coming into Border Patrol, Customs Border Protection custody became even more dramatic when 3 children in Border Patrol custody died in custody. This was the winter 2018-19. Felipe, Carlos, Jacqueline died. These are all Guatemalan children, died in custody. And it generated concern that the current capabilities were largely inadequate, and lawsuits were filed, class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of the children, saying that the US government was not living up to what was the standard of care outlined, what was known as the Flores Settlement Agreement, which was signed in the Clinton administration, that the government must provide safe and sanitary custodial standards in Border Patrol custody for children, And unaccompanied children, kids who cross the border are detained without a parent or family member, will need to be sent to Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, within 72 hours. And that was the Flores settlement. And clearly, this wasn't happening. And the judge, the federal court in which these lawsuits were filed, basically appointed a special master, a well-known Los Angeles lawyer, Andrea Orden, and I was appointed as a special expert to assist in the mediation of a new Flores settlement that had many specific provisions that would improve the conditions within these detention facilities. You get a sense of what the numbers were looking like. These were unaccompanied children, UCs, and the zero tolerance took place. You can see on this graph the MPP, which is the Remain in Mexico Migrant Protection Protocols, kind of Orwellian name for that program, which basically pushed people back to Mexico to await asylum hearings, really didn't make much difference. Title 42 is the public health regulation that allows the US government, with the outbreak of COVID, to basically expel all migrants, no questions asked, as soon as they cross the border. And Biden comes into office in 2021, and you could see a huge increase in the numbers of unaccompanied children, also families and others that hit the border, even though Title 42 has continued. And this is the continuation of that graph. And you can see that the numbers of unaccompanied children remains extremely high. We're talking about 14,000, 15,000 unaccompanied children taken into custody per month, and often highly concentrated in one border sector or another. And Border Patrol, as part of a new Flores settlement agreement, implemented new standards, created new facilities. This is the Rio Grande Valley facility for families and unaccompanied children. It's in Donna, Texas. And this is the new facility for children and families in El Paso, another very high census sector. And this is what it can look like when the numbers are extreme. These are unaccompanied kids in the Donna, Texas, the Rio Grande Valley sector, in Border Patrol custody. Now, I was there last week, and the numbers are much lower now. They are moving them much more quickly, but you can see what happens when the system gets overwhelmed. And this is the nursery area in that facility. And remember, unaccompanied children can be as young as 2 months of age. How does a 2-month-old cross the border? Well, they cross the border because they're handed over to an adult, a neighbor, or even an aunt or uncle cross the border, come into custody. They're considered unaccompanied children. Border Patrol has hired caregivers. You see some in the background, basically daycare workers, to work in these facilities, because functionally, Border Patrol is now running some of the largest daycare centers in the state of Texas. COVID policies continue under Biden and are expected to end in May. And the Biden administration is trying very hard to put into place new policies that in many ways will replace Title 42 and not rely on a public health protocol, but rather on new immigration protocols that will stem the border. And this is El Paso. About 6 weeks ago, where Governor Abbott deployed the National Guard. That's the Rio Grande. That's Ciudad Juarez in the background. It is a very complicated policy dynamic. And when people are pushed back across the border, they wind up in informal encampments like this, and can wind up staying for weeks or months in places that look like this. Now I'm going to tell you a story of, basically, I was hired by the court July 5th, 2019, and July 7th, I was in this facility. This was the old Ursula facility for children, Border Patrol facility in McAllen, Texas. It's the infamous Kids in Cages facility, and it no longer exists. It's been replaced. And my first day is the first time there was a external independent physician appointed by the court coming to these facilities. I remain the only external person given full access to these facilities. And I was met by Border Patrol and sort of a whole entourage of senior leadership from Homeland Security, got the tour. And then I said I wanted to go speak with some kids. They said, great. They said, fine. So I went in, and the first kid I spoke with was not this child, a kid that looked like this, was a shaggy-haired 12-year-old boy from Guatemala. And he said hello, talked with him a bit, and I began to say how sorry I was that we couldn't provide him with better custodial care than the place that he was currently located. I'm sorry that you had to sleep on mats on the floor with Milo blankets. We should be doing better. And I was really apologizing for the conditions that he was in. And he looked at me with a very puzzled look, and in Spanish said to me, Doc, this is my best day. And I was puzzled, and I said, well, what do you mean this is your best day? And he went on to explain that where he had come from, and I know the area in Guatemala, full disclosure, I've been working in Highland, Guatemala since I was a sophomore in college. And these are some of the villages in Highland, Guatemala that are very similar to where he had come from, where he was living. Extreme material deprivation, extreme poverty. And he explained that this was his reality, but also another part of his reality is, in fact, that Guatemala, the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, are some of the most violent places in the world. This is a plot of violent death rates. It's a few years old, but it's some of the best data we have. It has changed a bit. Ukraine is the most dangerous place in the world currently. Syria remains high, but look what comes next. Salvador, Venezuela, Virgin Islands, Honduras, Guatemala has moved up.
For Salvador, Venezuela.
Oh, my Siri is talking to me. I apologize. Then you get to the Afghanistan's. Then you get to the South Sudan's. That the Northern Triangle countries and many of the countries in Latin America are some of the most dangerous places in the world. And kids experiencing things that look like this. And this child, her son from Guatemala, had actually witnessed conditions like this. And that's why he left, he explained to me, because of the poverty and the violence. And he actually rode in La Bestia, the train that goes through parts of Mexico, coming from the Guatemalan border up to the US border. He also traveled like this in minivans for part of the way, and ultimately was placed in a stash house in the Mexican side of the border. He didn't know how long because he just lost complete track of time. And what he said basically to me was that this is my best day. I've made it to the United States. He didn't know what was going to happen to him specifically, but he knew that he was likely to be released to his parents who are already living in the United States, because unaccompanied children are exempt from Title 42, are exempt from virtually all the policies that turn kids back to Mexico or their home country. And we know that while things have greatly improved in Border Patrol, detention facilities, 24/7 medical care, improved food, temperature control, that once they are released into the United States, we lose complete track. We have no systems for these children once they're relieved into the United States. And this New York Times expose from several weeks ago documented that many of these unaccompanied children released to the United States are lost and wind up working in very dangerous jobs in some of the largest companies throughout the United States. And coming back to my friend Herson, we must recognize that there is no system for kids in the United States once released. There's no system of health care. Few states will provide health insurance for these children. Most will not. There is an effort by deeply committed pediatricians around the country to create a network of pediatric specialty care facilities around the country, so that when a child is released across the border, that they can be identified if they have a serious health problem and can be referred directly to a specialized program in the areas that they are headed to. That is the Specialty Care Access Network. But while it is comprised of deeply committed people struggling to provide high quality care for these kids, sometimes these kids have life-threatening illness, that in fact it receives no federal support, tragically, and very little foundation support. This issue has been heavily neglected. Now, in speaking with her son and speaking with the kids at the border can take on a different character. Yes, it is a geographic demarcation. It is a line in the sand. But in another way, this border demarcates who you were and what you can become, what you have experienced until you reach this border, and the possibilities of who you will be when you cross. It is, in fact, a border of what we usually call hope. And I know this notion of hope is more than a sentiment, a kind of touchy-feely, abstract emotional concept. On the border, it has become instrumental. It has become the currency of our immigration policies. A veteran Border Patrol agent told me that the most important factor that creates the surges at the border is, in fact, hope. The surge when Biden took office was about hope. And child separation, Title 42, and virtually all the proposed Biden policies that are going to replace Title 42 are an effort to diminish or eliminate hope, to eliminate any hope that they will be able to enter the United States. You come across the border, and with these policies in place, we will turn you back to Mexico or fly you back to your home country. You have no hope of being released into the United States. When they believe this, they will stop coming. Hope is the currency on the border. And Herson, in telling me it was his best day, while I was apologizing to him for being in that facility, Herson taught me something about the power of hope on the very first day I was on the job. Humanitarian health is a world of contradiction. It is a world of the worst and best in the world. It is a world of high ideals and unspeakable brutality, of impunity and remarkable resilience. Health workers are the ultimate inheritors of a failed social order. Sooner or later, we will see the clinical expression of this failure in our clinics, on the wards, or in the morgue. This has always generated the opportunity, if not the responsibility, of health workers to provide a humane narrative of what has occurred, of what has failed, but also the opportunities that have emerged. Each week, these grand rounds, medicine, pediatrics at Stanford, present remarkable discoveries and new, highly efficacious, new preventive and therapeutic interventions. But as efficacy grows, so too does the burden on society to provide it equitably to all those in need. The basic lessons of these experiences in Ukraine, on the US border, are that the challenges generated by extreme violence are dynamic, but so too are the opportunities to confront it with humane and newly effective interventions. These opportunities will demand new approaches, new strategies that rethink and ultimately remake humanitarian health initiatives, strategies that depend on greater collaborative infrastructure, like what we're seeing in Ukraine, like what we're struggling for to help unaccompanied children released into the United States. We are looking for meaningful collective action, what I would call solidarity. And solidarity is never discovered, it is created. My suggestion this morning is that as physicians, as health workers, we recognize that we have both the responsibility and the power to address these challenges and create the new strategies, new collaborative networks, and yes, the solidarity that is so desperately needed. And in doing so, help ensure that our clinical work, our programs and policies will ultimately prove both effective and just in some of the poorest and most violent places on earth. Thank you.
Dr. Weiss, thank you so much. Rather than me saying thank you, I want to just quote Dr. Weingarten here, put a comment in that I think a lot of people are thinking right now. He says, thank you for this profound talk. Great gratitude for your efforts to sustain hope in the face of such human catastrophes. I think that's perfect. And I imagine almost everybody is thinking that exact thing right now. So thank you for, first off, everything you do. And thank you for sharing that with us today. We have just a few minutes here. I wanted to see if we can get to just a few questions at least. I'll start with one here from Dr. Yusuf Hussein. It's over on the answered area because Dr. Shaw actually shared an article that both you, Dr. Wise, and Eran Ben David had worked on together. Her question it starts off by saying, thank you so much for this important presentation. It's interesting that 2 days ago marks the anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. Has there been any studies of state-sponsored terrorism like the invasion of Iraq or the ongoing, what's I might say some people refer to as apartheid attacks in Palestine on occupied territories of the West Banks? Any thoughts on that? And again, Jonathan shared an article. You've done research in this specific area.
Yes, thank you. Very important comment. And thank you for raising it. There have been studies that have looked at this. Again, they tend to focus on the direct effects, injuries related to violence. But we have been working with colleagues in these areas to try to assess the indirect effects, the reverberating, protracted effects on the well-being of not only children, but on the broader communities to assess the impact of these violent experiences, some state-sponsored, some non-state actors. And we are working hard to address this. The article by Iran and others, it was part of a Lancet series, documented some of these indirect effects in some of these areas. And I would suggest taking a look at those articles. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question here that's gotten a lot of upvotes by Dr. Gabriel Garcia. On May 11th, a new policy will bar asylum from non-Mexican migrants who arrive at the southern US border without having first sought and been denied asylum in at least one of the countries they pass through on their journey here. What do you anticipate will be the effect of this new policy on the health of children and families from sending communities in their home countries and along the migration route?
Yeah, this is an example of one of the proposed Biden policies to replace Title 42. And basically, it is something similar to what Trump implemented. I should say the Biden administration is providing more opportunities for legal immigration. But basically, this is an attempt to eradicate hope that if you come to the US border and cross, to eradicate hope that you will ever get into the United States. And these are legal frameworks to restrict migrants coming across the border. And I should say that we need the rule of law at the US border, just like we need the rule of law everywhere else in the United States. But the struggle to accommodate people leaving some of the most violent places on earth will bang up against some of these new policies in ways that are going to be hard to predict. Unaccompanied children are likely going to be exempt from these new policies. So it creates new incentive to self-separate families at the border, because it's far more likely your child will be released into the United States as an unaccompanied child than it would be as a family. So the implications are unclear. I currently serve as the juvenile care monitor for the US federal courts along the southern border. And one of the things we are watching carefully is, as Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, and Health and Human Services strengthen their capabilities to address any potential increase in the numbers of unaccompanied children that do cross in response to these new policies.
Thank you for that. I have a question, a couple of questions here just about helping. And the first one from Dr. Klein: is it preferable to donate to international societies like Doctors Without Borders or countries with internal medical care systems? Like, what's the best way you would recommend if someone wanted to donate?
Well, Doctors Without Borders does amazing work. And I have close colleagues that work not only in Ukraine, but all around the world. So if you would like to donate to Doctors Without Borders, MSF, I would strongly encourage that. There are other groups, the ICRC, International Rescue Committee, there are other groups, and also local groups that are working locally to support migrant health and social support in our local communities here in the Bay Area. Church groups are very important as well. I would seek out ways that not only to donate your money, but to get involved. And as physicians, we have the ability to use our professional organizations to push them beyond their usual, not to get too facetious, but dinners and award ceremonies, to build linkages with groups dealing with this. Here, we have Families at the Border, which is Stanford health community members building collaborations with colleagues providing services for migrants in Tijuana. People can get involved with Families at the Border. We welcome everybody, students, community members, physicians, nurses, health workers. And this is a direct link in supporting services being provided in Tijuana with colleagues there. So I would suggest Families at the Border, the Specialty Care Access Network, as well as pushing our professional societies to build collaboration with health worker colleagues in areas in desperate need of support.
Thanks, Dr. Wise. The last question I wanted to end on, you kind of touched on it some, but Dr. Linda Clever asked, thank you for your heroic work, and what can we do? And I was thinking the same thing before. Again, you've answered some of it. What can we do beyond just giving gifts to international rescue committees? So what, as physicians, anything else to add to that we can do to help?
Well, I think I covered
Yeah.
my last comment, but I would add is get to know some of these migrant kids and families, get to know the Ukrainian workers, the workers in Poland who are so deeply committed, working around the clock to help these people. I appreciate your appreciation for me, but we're talking about the people in Poland, part of the Safer Ukraine network, the workers in Lviv and throughout Ukraine, the workers on the border, but talk to them, talk to the migrants that come to our communities, learn from their resilience and strength. You will be better for it personally, but also you will get great ideas about how you could get more involved and be more effective in providing your support and caring.
And I just want to, Dr. Abby, thank you for noting in the comments here that through Airbnb, you can offer to host refugees that have been cleared through the process to resettle in the US. Dr. Shah, thanks for sending the Global Health Families at the Borders link as well with more information to help as well. Given it's 9:04, I'll close this out. I mentioned a couple of comments here. Dr. Behe says, Dr. Wise, thank you for the tremendous work in all parts of the world. Dr. Clever says, Paul, do you ever sleep? It isn't easy to be the only, quote unquote, only. I think we all share our appreciation for everything you've done. And again, Dr. Wise, thank you for being the amazing person you are. I was going to say doctor, but really just human being, and for leading by example. Thank you for being with her today. And thank you everybody for sticking with us. Hope you have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week.
Thanks, Errol. Thank you all.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.